WNYC Studios is supported by Bard College's Sustainability Program, whose hybrid Bard MBA helps train leaders to innovate solutions to social, environmental, and economic challenges. Apply by May 1st for fall enrollment at gps.bard.edu.
The Takeaway is brought to you by Progressive. Have you tried the Name Your Price tool yet? It works just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show you coverage options that fit your budget. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to find a rate that works for you. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive. Get your quote today at Progressive.com and see why 4 out of 5 new auto customers recommend Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
This is The Takeaway. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. On Wednesday night, Congress passed a $1.5 trillion omnibus spending bill that would fund the government through September. It includes nearly $14 billion in humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. The bill does not contain aid to continue battling the pandemic. Still, it's one of the largest spending packages in American history. One part of this spending package is directed toward new cybersecurity protections for the U.S., which the Senate passed last week. Republican Senator Rob Portman from Ohio spoke on the Senate floor last week, urging the House to act quickly in signing this cybersecurity bill.
So what the Russians are doing is appalling, and the entire freedom-loving world needs to stand up to it, and we need to help Ukraine more. But one thing they have also done is they've launched these cyber attacks against the Ukrainian government and against the private sector infrastructure in Ukraine. That too is a place where we can help. But again, we need to be sure that we have our own house in order here to be able to be more helpful, to be able to provide the best practices and to help Ukraine be able to deal with these attacks, both kinetic attacks, these military attacks, and also the cyber attacks.
Although cyber attacks from Russia against Ukraine so far have been low level, there is rising concern that Russian-backed hackers could disrupt key infrastructure and resources, like electricity or fuel, in Ukraine. Now, Russia's big first cyber attack against Ukraine happened back in 2015 after Russia's attempt to annex Crimea. It launched a blackout attack against Ukrainian electric companies using malware that resulted in blackouts for almost 250,000 Ukrainians. And some lawmakers are worried about Russia turning its ire toward the U.S. Last May, a Russian hacker was responsible for a ransomware attack against the Colonial Pipeline that led to 2 widespread gas shortages along the East Coast. The Russian authorities said they arrested that hacker back in January. Now, for more on this, we have Joseph Marks, writer at Cybersecurity 202 newsletter for The Washington Post. Welcome to The Takeaway, Joe.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
Okay, so in the midst of all this, multiple responses. I work at a couple different organizations, and sort of yesterday, every IT manager with whom I work is sending emails saying, okay, you got to go to 2-factor authentication, sort of all the things we know are good practices. But let me just start by asking, are those the kinds of practices that will protect us from a significant cyber attack?
In the aggregate, they definitely are. You know, the thing about even the most aggressive and savvy Russian hackers is most of what they do just relies on the lowest level things, right? They don't need to do anything too complicated because we are so underprotected in most cases. So organizations that are doing just the basics of having 2-factor authentication set up, making sure that, you know, when someone leaves the company, they don't leave that email account out there for a hacker to take over and start sending out spam emails to all of his or her coworkers. That sort of thing really makes a huge difference in protecting an organization.
So password 123, that is an insufficient password, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's talk about what cyber warfare does look like in this day and age.
Yeah, that's a big question that people have been pondering over for a long time. And it's interesting because, you know, the last decade, the ability of the most capable nations, you know, Russia, China, the United States, to launch really devastating cyber attacks has increased remarkably but there hasn't been a real major conflict either between those nations or what we're seeing in Ukraine, which is a highly cyber capable nation, and Russia going after a nation that, can't hack like Russia can, but Ukraine is definitely deeply connected and reliant on the internet for a lot of its business. We haven't seen anything like that yet. A lot of people had thought what we would see is what they call hybrid war, where the military invasion was coupled with really substantial cyber attacks that shut off power for a lot of Ukrainians, that jammed communication so the government and Ukrainian military couldn't communicate with each other, that really targeted citizens so that they would lose faith in their government. We have not seen that yet, and there are a lot of questions about why that is.
Why do you think it is? That's exactly what I was going to ask, is if given that that was the expectation, and certainly there's some capability for doing that, why does this look like, in some ways, such an, I almost hate to use this language, but an almost old-fashioned war?
Yeah, there are a couple of big theories. One is just wait. We're going to see it sometime in the next several weeks or months when Russia really needs it. They're going to pull these things out. That's definitely a possibility. Another possibility is the most devastating cyber attacks take a lot of upfront work, and Russian hackers could have just not been terribly well prepared for this. You've seen the military getting bogged down. Things are not going as President Putin expected. It could be that the plans they had for cyber attacks just haven't come off as well as they might have. Another big theory is that, a lot of the concern about cyber war has been a little bit ginned up, because cyber attacks are great when you're in an asymmetric conflict, right? When you want to upset the U.S. without getting into an actual war, you can do things like meddle in elections or, launch ransomware attacks that hit colonial pipeline, things like that. But when it comes to an actual war, if you want to cause panic, you're already engaged with actual military weapons. If you want to take out power, you can send a rocket that does that much more easily than you launch a cyber attack.
Right. So the cyber attack is perhaps more valuable as a tool of warfare if you're not already engaged in this kind of hot war on the ground.
Right. When you're engaged in a hot war, it's often a lot easier just to use a rocket or a bomb or a gun to accomplish what you want to accomplish.
There have been some low-level attacks thus far. Can you sort of spell those out for us?
Yeah, most of those on the Russian side have been two things. One, what we call wiper attacks. So even before the invasion began, Kremlin-linked hackers were targeting Ukrainian government organizations and some industries, energy, finance, that sort of thing, and wiping data from their computers. That makes it much more difficult for them to communicate with the public. We've also seen a little bit from the Ukrainian side toward Russia, mostly run by what they call a volunteer IT army, essentially doing what Ukrainians are doing on the streets now when they pick up AK-47s and defend their territory. These are people who work in tech, either in Ukraine or with sympathy for Ukraine, who have volunteered to both defend Ukraine's IT infrastructure in the digital landscape, and in some cases, they've been launching some low-level offensive attacks. Most of those have been denial of service attacks, where they try to basically overwhelm Russian government computers with traffic so that their websites can't operate anymore. In other cases, they've been doing a sort of psychological warfare where they'll send images of dead Russian soldiers to the population, trying to break through Russian censorship.
Talk to me about U.S. vulnerability. We have definitely come to a point in this conflict where, I'm beginning to get the text messages from well-meaning friends that are sort of amping up my anxiety around some of this. So either talk me down or help me prepare here. What are some of the ways we should be thinking about U.S. vulnerability? And again, strategically, what would be the value of cyber attacks either against the U.S. or against Western Europe?
Well, the strategic value is much more, Putin tends to lash out. And, with the barrage of really serious sanctions that the U.S. and Western allies have imposed on Russia recently, he may want to send a message. And so U.S. organizations have been on relatively high alert for weeks, if not months at this point. One of the problems is if you talk about the top firms in the United States, finance firms, things like that, they tend to have really good protections. They've spent a lot of time going through both the technological protections they need and the human protections, because usually the weakest link in these things is that, one employee who clicks on a spam email and that just has repercussions that, redound for weeks upon weeks. So those top firms are doing really well, but all of these smaller firms that are interconnected throughout our landscape may not have those firms. So the HVAC company that serves that IT firm, the suppliers for that firm, a lot of these companies don't have the kinds of protections that the big guys do. And that's where Russia might get in.
And do you have a sense then of how this new cybersecurity bill, I always worry a bit about such a thing. On the one hand, as I hear you talking about the ways that simply locking the front door can really make a big difference against this kind of crime, right? Locking the cyber front door in this case. But I'm wondering sort of in this cybersecurity bill that is now passed and now has big funding behind it, are those the kind of resources that will make a difference? And in that cybersecurity, are there any anxieties or challenges about freedoms, particularly maybe intellectual freedoms? War can sometimes lead us in our fear to make security-based choices that also then ultimately reduce liberty.
This is a start in getting the cyber landscape in order. One of the problems is we talk a lot about the cyber threats to the United States, but government in particular doesn't have a really good handle on how bad they are, because a lot of times there are hacks that we just don't know about. The requirements for companies to disclose when you're hacked are really minimal. They vary from state to state. There's often a long lag time. And even that often they don't report it just as they don't know. So the goal of this bill is to mandate that at least companies in critical sectors like finance, energy, healthcare, transportation have to report to the government within 3 days if they suffer a cybersecurity incident, and then a much larger group has to report if they pay a ransom. The goal of that is if there's something like a concerted Russian attack, hopefully the government will spot it more quickly and then be able to alert other companies in that sector to protect themselves. Also, they'll just be able to gather better information so they can make smarter cyber policy in the future. Whether this invades liberties at all, it's, I suppose, conceivable that this could get more of citizens' personal information to the government. That's been a longstanding concern about bills like this. This one is relatively tempered because the information is only going to the Department of Homeland Security. It is pointedly not going to the FBI, which is something the FBI had really lobbied for but did not get. And in general, in terms of your personal information being exposed, that's happening by hackers so much already. You're really in far more danger from that than from the government perhaps getting its hands on the same information.
If part of warfare now is this cyber warfare, then I'm presuming that tech companies have a role to play that is perhaps distinct from something that they've previously done. And so I guess I'm wondering, in this particular moment, are tech companies ramping up to be soldiers in the cyber war on behalf of Ukraine?
They are, but a lot of what they're doing is what they've been doing for quite a while, which is, we talked about the government not having a lot of visibility into the hacking threat. The groups that often have much more visibility are companies like Microsoft and companies like Google that have customer accounts all over the world. So they're seeing what's going on often much better than the United States is, the United States government is. Microsoft did an operation to take down one seemingly Russia-based attack against Ukrainian computers. There have been other announcements from companies like Cloudflare and Google about that. So they're doing what they've been doing for quite a while, but on a relatively heightened alert.
Joseph Marks is the writer of the Cybersecurity 202 newsletter for The Washington Post. Joe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, an honest conversation about returning to the office.
Forced communal lunches or the strongly suggested communal lunch. Open floor plan. Coming back to work is partially about surveillance and micromanagement, and people of color feel that in a different way. Everybody feels it, but people of color feel it in a different way.
That's the New Yorker Radio Hour from WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.